So I'm going to be jumping between two kind of PowerPoint slides or kind of presentations that I've put together. The first one is specifically kind of for the installation itself. And the next one will be just quickly running through what kind of brought me to this place, which was doing my thesis work. I just graduated from a program this past spring, sorry. And all through the winter and even a bit last fall, I was working on my thesis project, which was looking at Tin Can Beach and the former sugar refinery site. So it will be good to get some of that context. And right now that presentation is lagging a little bit, as in it's not opening, but I think it will soon. So I'm going to start by taking you guys through kind of the process of how I made the installation that some of you may have seen uptown. Christina, I know, I saw you last night. I met you. So the actual installation is kind of these pieces of landscape, pieces of ground, and cultural materials, construction debris, ballast, and plant material that would have existed at Tin Can Beach or continues to exist at Tin Can Beach. And what I did was transport some of those materials to a site in the industrial park and allowed the vegetation from seed to grow in those mounds. And so I'll talk a little bit about that material, the process through which I guess I made these mounds, and the process of actually planting and talking about the reasoning behind the plants that I selected to grow. So this is how they looked all summer, pretty much. Planted in the industrial park, a pretty familiar scene in St. John, and ground conditions that are actually really similar to those at Tin Can Beach or in another not necessarily reclaimed area, infill area, but somewhere where there's a lot of disturbance to the land, pollution, likely and contamination in the soil, and a lot of the vegetative species that kind of take advantage in those situations. And so a few weeks or months later, this is what the installation has looked like uptown. And I know some of you have gone to visit a little bit. So the process of actually making the installation was kind of looking at Tin Can Beach and the former sugar refinery site, which is highlighted in green there, and derived from my interest, and I think an interest that a lot of St. Johners have in the materials on that site and kind of the condition on the site. So I know this is a familiar site to most of us probably, where on site there is bedrock exposed on the Tin Can Beach side. And then as soon as you start making your way over looking towards the west side, it becomes an area that was totally infilled and used to, 300 plus years ago would have been a mud flat kind of condition, and has been built up over the years. And so the kind of materials that we're looking at are construction debris from when the former sugar refinery was demolished in 2004, and the remnants of wharfs that were either constructed then around 1912 or before that, when it acted as the ballast wharf for the city. And so my interest in the site kind of informed an approach that I had to designing my thesis project, which was about looking really closely at the materials on site and trying to kind of act as an investigator. So looking at all of the material conditions and the different layers and trying to figure out, predict, or track kind of where these materials may have come from. And so a lot of the surface materials I've kind of assumed have come from the former sugar refinery site that was on site for 100 years. And so those are relatively new, even though 1912 is not so new. But when you go down to the coastline, as the picture in the middle shows, where the site is actually eroding, you get kind of a cross section through the site that shows all of these different material deposits. And it brings up really interesting stories. For example, highlighted there kind of in the middle is this like shale layer that you would assume, you know, some demolition had to be done at some point of a rock outcrop, and it was dumped in this area. And this cross section changes the whole way along the site, which makes it a really interesting spot where if you are looking closely at the materials, can be really engaging. And looking at that hand in hand with the history becomes a really kind of fun activity. And so just more images of these kind of cross sections or materials that have been deposited on the site. So the process, and I will say right now, most of the photos you'll see are from my friend Tim McGraw, who really helped out a lot with the project. He joined me and helped install everything, and my friend David Beckingham helped me with that too. But Tim took some really amazing photos and did some cool edits. So this was us down at the site, kind of exploring all of the different materials, as I'm sure many St. Johners have done. And just kind of practicing this idea of looking closely and thinking about the history of the site and the history of the city and what might have brought certain materials there. So with all that being said, the process of actually building the mounds did kind of originate with this idea. So taking materials from this site and actually transporting them to the site of the installation in the industrial park. So it's the idea of looking really closely, and then also of kind of what the ecological conditions are on the site. And again, looking closely at the species that you can find there. And what's kind of found, I guess, is that most of the species that arise in contaminated, disturbed, compacted sites have to be really resilient. And so people call it, I guess, you know, spontaneous vegetation, other terms like that, basically for weeds, for things that can grow in really harsh conditions and typically exist along kind of railway paths, in contaminated soils, or areas that generally don't have nutrient-rich or well-draining soils. And so I got really interested as my studies were in landscape architecture. So I love plants. And so I got really interested in what these species were that were occurring on site, and in little pockets like the image shown on the right here. And so I'll get more into that when I share my second presentation. But this is just a little primer. So we transported a lot of these materials and soils from the site to the industrial site. And I ordered a bunch of seeds off of the internet from around the world in order to bring them to St. John, reintroduce them to St. John, and plant them into these mounds, kind of furthering that idea of kind of transporting these landscapes from the soil all the way up through into the vegetation that was being grown. And so I laid these on pallets and cut some filter fabric so that they wouldn't sink through, and basically piled all these materials on top and planted the seeds. And so that's how these actual mounds were kind of grown and came into fruition. They were then left to grow for the summer, and were transported. They were very heavy, and so they were transported on a crane, Larry's crane to be precise. And so they gave us a really great hand, and were great kind of supporters of the project. And we transported these mounds all the way uptown. And what the resulting kind of form is, and I might have to flip back here, the resulting form with these boards and these kind of boxed in areas. So we were going for a look of having these being kind of shipping crates. And what it did was, what we hoped it would do, is create some interest in the site and kind of generate an architectural form that would encourage people to go and engage and look closely at the materials themselves. So without having these crates, which originally the idea was for practical considerations, actually moving these mounds, they might just kind of spill out when they were on the truck. And so they had suggested, you should probably box them in or at least cover them. And because we had to crane lift them, we didn't end up boxing them in until they arrived on site. But we think that this form really encourages interest and generates some intrigue if you don't know what's in that last box, for example. And you start looking a bit closer at the materials and hopefully get a bit more engaged then. And so the plant species themselves, I'll talk to just really briefly right now. So I'm going to flip back. So this was all of the species were historic ballast species. So plants that originally are not native to this area, and were actually discovered or collected by this local St. John botanist named George Upham Hay, who between 1871 and 1906, I think 1910 or 1910, collected a lot of samples of species that he found in the mounds of ballast at the former sugar refinery site. So these were species that arrived from all over the world and that hadn't been seen here before. And most of them, as I had said, are weeds pretty much, species that are take advantage of conditions that other plants might not. So he called them accidental introductions, which I really love. So that's basically that within the ballast that was arriving in the city, so all of the heavy material that they would use to weight down the ships, and that was all of this material would arrive in the city because most ships arriving here, especially in the early days, were going to be exporting material. So St. John was a big exporter of timber and fish. And so when ships arrived here, they would have to be able to cross the ocean safely, which requires them to use ballast. And the same practice is used today with water and invasive species, kind of microorganisms and fish, and all sorts of other small species are still an issue in ballast that modern shipping vessels use. And that's something they now filter for because things like zebra mussels, for example, up the St. Lawrence have been a huge, multi-billion-dollar effort to help restore the damage they've done. And those were introduced in ship ballast. So this is still a kind of relevant trend, but this project looks at the historic species. So I am going to just jump over to my other presentation. I'll flip through these slides because I know they're on here. So these were my initial kind of studies of the Tin Can Beach site. So I did a detailed drawing of the existing conditions on site and started this kind of inventory of materials. And I even started breaking it down to the actual, different types of brick, different concrete aggregates, and seeing if I'd be able to source where those would have actually come from, which proved to be really difficult, but is something that I'd still really love to continue to do. And so this is the cross section and just kind of studying that existing condition that we'd looked at. So I'm going to jump out of this presentation and open up the other one, and I'm just going to quickly go through those slides. which were from my school year, kind of the things that brought me to this point. And then I'm going to open up and see if you guys have any questions, because I know I've already been talking for a long time. So my thesis work was looking at a proposal for the Tin Can Beach and former sugar refinery site. So you'll recognize that aerial there. And what my proposal was called was Performance Park. I was talking about all of the different modes of performance that existed on the site, and especially focused on the vegetation on site and the potential, and speaking about that kind of spontaneous vegetation that whose performance, in a technical term, I found really interesting. And I started considering the potential of this site as a place for testing the performance of a few different things. What really became a vision for kind of community engagement on this site that dealt well with existing materials, or that took advantage of existing materials and existing conditions in the city to help engage people with the history that's kind of embodied in the site. So these are just a selection of images, and I am going to go through this fairly quickly, and if there's any questions after. So I was looking at this as a case study really within or for post-industrial colonial waterfront sites, and how shipping arriving on these sites across the eastern seaboard have really impacted local vegetation and how people perceive those sites. I know St. John has a really, well, I won't get into it, but I was looking at these kind of global shipping routes and the historic shipping routes arriving in St. John, and where the majority of ships were arriving from. So you can see, based on kind of the thickness of the line, that a lot of kind of Southeast Asian and European ships were arriving in St. John. And a lot of the species themselves that George Upham Hay uncovered on the site kind of match this, this alignment. The other thing that I guess they are aligned with is the climatic conditions. So in the dark gray there is where the majority of these species that now have been either naturalized in New Brunswick or continue to exist as invasive species in North America have come from. So the majority coming from China all the way through to the Middle East and the Mediterranean region. And at the bottom here are all of the species that you had seen before that George Upham Hay had collected. And I kind of sourced where these had originated from and mapped them out. And so St. John, I am going to skip through a lot of these slides, but ultimately what it brings us to is the development of the shoreline of the city itself, and how we had acted as, my computer's freezing up here a bit, where we were acting as an exporter and as a hub, a marine hub, how our city shoreline was kind of formalized over time. And so the first action that happened in order to formalize the city shoreline was the blasting of the city streets. So in order to form this kind of first street grid that was laid out in 1761 and had been worked on for at least 50 years before that, was blasting the bedrock that existed on the peninsula and pushing that material down to the water's edge. And so by 1840, we had a really complex series of wharfs and slips that formalized and made it a really functional space. So by 1894, all of the debris from the Great Fire had been also pushed to the city's edges, and all the way down the coast at Market Slip and further down into the Lower Cove were basically built up using a lot of the debris, and that can be seen in any kind of boreholes or test pits that are dug. All along this shoreline, you find bits of burnt wood and broken pottery and all sorts of materials from that. So in 1912, this kind of area, which was formerly the ballast wharf through all of that time, and was built up using this kind of ballast that was arriving, was formalized and became a stable site where they were able to build and expand on industrial operations. So the sugar refinery was constructed then. And in the 1970s, the Lower Cove itself was infilled, and our site was, the sugar refinery was demolished. And so since 2004, it has stayed that way. And my computer's still being a bit slow, not really loading these drawings, but so this is just looking at the really complex ownership, land ownership that still exists on that site today, and has caused, concern, I guess, for anyone looking to do development there or considering what potential future uses the site has. One of the major ones being the Canadian National Rail owning a section that cuts through and basically cuts off access to the site. So I'll keep moving here. Looking at the demolition, and really what all of the next series of slides are doing are looking at that idea of the existing condition on the site and how we can start looking really closely at the materials on site and assessing their usefulness moving forward, and how we as a city can kind of engage with these materials, the vegetative materials and the cultural materials, I guess, debris and remnant foundations and all those things, in order to not just cap over the site. So the major issue with this area is that it is really contaminated. So I'll just go through these slides really quickly, so this site itself is really contaminated from all of the years of industrial use that it's seen. And that means that any development that happens on the site moving forward is to be, is going to have to be capped. And there's a limit where only kind of a one story high building could be built there. Or it could be used for recreational use. And so just to end, because I know I've been talking for a long time now, my proposal was basically to create a performance venue on the site that reused the existing building foundations and a series of kind of engaging actions and movements of materials to create different areas of program that included a street tree nursery, for the city's south end, as well as a kind of seed orchard for butternut trees, which is a tree that historically, and I think I'll get there, historically has been of significance, but hasn't been, and actually has a history as well of being moved. So the population of butternut trees in New Brunswick was actually introduced here from the Wolastoqiyik people, and actually operates in isolation from the rest of its population. So you can see here, the butternut trees are isolated, and butternut trees right now are being decimated by an imported canker. And so it's believed that our population of those species has increased resilience to them. And so the idea was that with the street tree nursery and the seed nursery, that this could begin, people could begin engaging with the vegetation again, or begin engaging with the vegetation on site and return the site to a kind of productive use, while continuing to think about the performance ultimately of all of the vegetation on site, and how we could take advantage of that, and providing a space for a cultural performance venue. So I know that these two kind of presentations that I've shown are a bit removed from each other, but I did think it might be helpful for me to show this kind of work just as a way of introducing how I came to the point where an installation that actually transported a piece of the landscape that existed on this site, both current day and using these kind of historic materials, I guess where it had its roots. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate the time. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Blake. It's really interesting to hear about your research in school, your thesis. I know anyone who's written a thesis has a million things to say on their topic. And it's just really interesting to hear the context around your third shift installation. And I love those photos. Who was one you took the photos where it's you?
Yeah, Tim McGraw.
Tim McGraw. Yeah, those
Yeah.
are amazing.
Yeah.
I really like those.
Yeah, he's really talented.
Yeah, would you mind sending one to me for us to use to promote this recording?
Of course.
Yeah, awesome, thank you. We can take questions from people. If you want to put a question in the chat, I can see the chat, so I can relay it to Blake. Or you can just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, this is Hillary, Blake's sister. Hi, Blake. Nice presentation. Sorry, I couldn't find the chat, so I just thought I'd chime in. Blake, I'm wondering if you can actually describe a little bit more what street tree nursery is. I just don't have an understanding of what that might look like.
Thanks, Hill. Yeah, for sure. So what? I guess the driving force between that, or for that, as something I was exploring in my thesis work, was that the city of St. John doesn't have any street tree plan officially. And there are certain areas of the city where there has been investment in street trees, but they have had a hard time kind of maintaining and upkeeping those. And especially the city's south end is really lacking in any green space, really. Not just as like open passive space like Tin Can Beach provides, or active space like Rainbow Park, for example, but actual streetscapes that really help to kind of lift up neighborhoods, and in summer provide shade and all of the good benefits that street trees offer. And so with my proposal itself, it was actually a series of interventions, I guess, that would eventually remediate the soil enough so that street trees could be grown kind of in this space. And so what that looked like, and I think if I scroll a little bit here, I can find them. My computer isn't cooperating really, but so the hope was actually to use some of these historic species even. Wow. So to seed with red clover, to retain certain paths of travel in between existing foundations, to build up organic material from the cities and from their maintenance staff that I was speaking with in order to kind of use this old technique of hugelkultur, which is basically mounding up, making a base of logs or of debris, and then piling over with leaves and then soil, and allowing that to sit really for years, like 5 to 8 years, and that will decompose and really create a solid base of organic, really high organic matter soil. And so the idea was really to kind of complete this process through and through. So it was over the course of 25 years ultimately, in order to create this kind of street tree nursery. So a place where the city itself, their biggest barrier to planting new trees is the cost of them, because they buy them directly from nurseries at like $350 or $450 a tree, and often aren't able to keep them up. So the idea is that if you grow trees in the setting, in the environmental conditions that they will eventually live in, that they would be a lot more apt to be successful, and would be a lot less costly. So it would provide kind of young whips if you plant really densely to distribute to the local population, like of the South End for their own planting, and then more mature trees over time for the city to take out. And then you would amend the soil and kind of repeat that process. And here's just an image of how it could be imagined for use.
Thank you. Very cool.
Thanks.
So we have a question in the chat, a few questions in the chat. The first one is Graham Stewart Robertson. Says, thanks for your continued interest in Tin Can Beach, Blake. I loved the installation and your presentation of your design project. It's nice.
Thanks, Graham.
Marianne Ketchum is wondering, what was the driving force behind this thesis topic? How did you become interested?
Thanks, Marianne. Well, I mean, the site itself was really, I think, the driving factor. There's been a lot of interest in Tin Can Beach and this kind of site, this really massive kind of derelict site right in the uptown that has beautiful views into the harbor over to Partridge Island. And it is, you know, a kind of hidden gem. And I think that I've always really loved that spot. I would go there like from in high school, I guess. I'd go there and just kind of hang out and explore. So it's been really, I've had an interest in that site, and I think it helped kind of guide my interests when I moved into school as well, where I got in landscape architecture, got really interested in the idea of materials and kind of really like, you know, I don't want to say, you know, the ugly stuff really of the city, because especially in St. John, but in all cities, there are areas where often kind of industrial areas that have had contamination, and areas that are really highly impacted and have been shaped by the history that they've kind of undergone. So the port cities, like along the eastern seaboard, a lot of them have spaces similar to this, where ships would have either been dumping ballast or they just became, you know, industrial zones on coastal industrial zones. And so I got really interested in that, and the idea that if you do pay close attention to the materials that are otherwise just kind of seen as dirty garbage, which, you know, they are, but that there's so much history in that, and that you can kind of read into all of those things. Like, for example, there's like yellow brick that you can find all through this site. And just from reading and the kind of research I've done, learned that, okay, like yellow brick was produced in northern New Brunswick or in up the St. John River, but it was they stopped making that in the 1920s or 30s. And so you can start kind of putting rough dates and locations to where these would have arrived from. And there are even resources online for especially bricks of where people kind of try to source bricks. So I found there are some down there that or that I've figured out have come from Scotland, imported at some point. And so I just find that fascinating. Yeah, thanks, Marian.
Barbara Creamer says, it's wonderful to see the final results of your hard work during your master's program, Blake. It would be amazing to see the city of St. John embrace your work to benefit its inhabitants and the streetscapes.
Cool. Thumbs up. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I hope so too. I mean, I'm just really happy to be back in St. John or in New Brunswick, because it's where I'm from and care deeply about this place. So I hope to be able to keep kind of engaging with these topics, and I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to share some of this stuff because I do find it so interesting. I'm glad you folks do as well, or some other people.
Awesome. Well, we'll do one last call for questions before we wrap up. Is there any closing thoughts from anybody? Ooh, Chrissy. Christiana says, hi, Blake. Awesome project. I think it's really interesting how we often think of land as being inherently local, but your work demonstrates the international influence on the formation of the landscape, plus the introduction of plants. I wondered if you could talk a bit about your experience observing that international social history in the quote unquote natural landscape. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that is definitely what I've found so fascinating, that you do think about, yeah, the land as being inherently local. I think especially at Tin Can Beach, and the former sugar refinery site, and at all of these sites. I mean, the trend really that I've seen for approaches for kind of redevelopment or engagement with these kind of landscapes is to remediate them through whatever form is selected, or to cap them. And to me, I mean, you know, of course, if something's really contaminated, you can't be exposed to that. But I think there's a real interest in engaging with that, not necessarily contamination, but with the history, like the material history of a place. And to kind of get to your point, I guess, like, the main approach is kind of a renaturalization approach. So to plant kind of native species and to return a space back to a certain period that is not always necessarily, you know, you kind of pick a moment in time and say, well, these are the native species. And then would plant those in order to kind of restore an ecosystem. But in a place like Tin Can Beach or in the former sugar refinery site, or any of these types of sites that are built on reclaimed land, and especially ones that had material arriving from elsewhere to help shape it, there is no real natural condition for something like that. And so my project and my explorations were really about that kind of plant performance and thinking about, you know, there are native species that really thrive on those sites and have come in, and most of it is native, but there are also species that have either been naturalized here or have really interesting relationships with our existing ecologies that still could be used. And just because they aren't a native species doesn't necessarily mean that they should be nixed kind of right away from what we think about as being like a restoration project. So I think that's that's a big point, I guess, from my interests, from the kind of ecology side, about what it means to have kind of a international landscape. But you've got to be cautious with that, because obviously planting invasive species is never a never a good thing. And so I didn't do that here. I didn't plant anything that could harm our existing environment or really outcompete any of it. But I think having a diversity of species, for example, is one way that you can start thinking about how to treat these sort of landscapes differently, that allow people to start thinking or getting interested in the kind of richer history of land or one of these landscapes. I hope that made sense.
Great, thank you, Blake. Any other questions from folks? Gracie says, so cool, thank you.
Thank you. Good.
Okay, great. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you, Blake, for all the hard work you put into your third shift installation. I know it's well loved, and I know people are approaching it with curiosity, which is my hope for the festival, is that people maybe gain a new interest in a topic they may not have thought about before. And I think this is an interesting topic that that many of us may have encountered in our day-to-day lives, maybe going to Tin Can Beach, seeing some weird stuff, but not really taking it the one step further. So thank you for all of your research and hard work, and for sharing it with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katie, for all of your work. It's incredible. And the work of the other artists too. It's awesome. I'm so happy to be a part of it. And yeah, I really appreciate your work.
I think Larry's Crane deserves one more shout out.
Yeah.
Wrap it up. Thank you, Larry, if you're watching.
Yeah, Larry and Shane. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, great. Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody.
Thank you all. Thanks, Katie.